going to now introduce our Senate panel. And so Todd and Dimitri should be good to turn your cameras on and have the capabilities there. And I am going to pull up my slides here for you all. So like I said, with our House panelists, I could speak for days talking about the accomplishments of these two folks here. But to give some quick introductions, on the Republican side, we have Dimitri Karakitsos, who serves as Holland and Knight's senior Senate Republican political liaison, coordinating on behalf of clients with GOP leadership, committee chairmen, and members of the Senate Republican Conference on issues critical to the firm's clients. He successfully worked with numerous clients on Capitol Hill and within the executive branch on issues ranging from energy and environment to trade and international treaties. He's advocated on behalf of companies on legislative initiatives, including the National Defense Authorization Act reauthorization process, federal infrastructure bills, appropriations, tax reform proposals, as well as energy and environment-related legislation. Next, we have Todd Wooten, who prior to joining Holland and Knight, Mr. Wooten was a lobbyist and consultant for a prominent Washington government relations and public relations firm. He also served as interim vice president for government affairs for the National Football League. In addition, Mr. Wooten served on 3 Senate committees for 4 senators. During his time on Capitol Hill, he served as the director of outreach and senior counsel for energy and tax on the Senate Committee on Finance, where he coordinated the committee's communications to businesses and organizations. He also brings additional Senate experience from his time on the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition and Forestry, and as the legislative director for Senator Debbie Stabenow. So thank you so much for both of you for being here, and I will get our slides up here on the screen. All right, I will kick it over to you both to get us started here.
Perfect. I think Dimitri is going to get us rolling on the races that we have decided. And then I'm going to take the races that we don't have decided as we were preparing for this. It's amazing in this day and age that we're doing a post-election rundown on an election which has not yet finished. But we're going to do our best. So I'll turn it over first to what we actually know.
Yeah, thanks. And as I'm sure all of you know, we've got 4 races yet uncalled. One is, basically in the bag for Republicans, that's Alaska. And then we've got, the other 3, so we got a best of 3 basically to take control of the Senate. I think we can just go ahead and write to the next slide, please.
There we go.
Obviously when this cycle started, Republicans were defending 21 seats to 14 from the Democrats. Not major surprises. I think that Republicans knew the toughest holds were going to be Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Obviously, the only seat that has flipped so far is Pennsylvania, with Lieutenant Governor Fetterman beating Dr. Oz. But in general, things held kind of where we thought with Bennett in Colorado, Rubio in Florida. I think Florida was a bit of a surprise in the size of the vote there. Obviously we know Georgia with the runoff, and Todd will talk more about that. Ted Budd holding on in North Carolina, Senator Hassan in New Hampshire, the seat staying red in Ohio with J.D. Vance, Senator Murray winning in Washington, Senator Johnson in Wisconsin. I think from a Republican perspective, at least, the only thing I'd say is, I think the thought was it was going to come down to where it came down. I think Republicans really did try to kind of stretch the map. And so there was a lot of talk of Washington and New Hampshire and Colorado, which are at this point pretty blue states, I think, for the most part. So I think, although they tried to kind of stretch the map, losing those, in my opinion, isn't kind of the end of the world, and still alive and kicking. So Todd, you want to get more details on what we're still waiting for?
Sure, absolutely. I would be remiss if I did not make at least one comment concerning, kind of as we're looking out and what was expected and what wasn't. I felt like that With the passage of the IRA, you know, I think there was a time whenever Dems definitely felt like they were on the rise, and maybe there is a chance in a place like Ohio or something like that. They were definitely feeling really good in August, but you know, that really pivoted hard, really in October, I would say. And there was a sense amongst, I think, a lot of folks, this is something that we'll come back to a little bit later, you know, that there was this big momentum towards the Republican side. And, you know, I had a number of folks from our side of the aisle ask me about what I thought about Washington State. I used to work for Senator Wyden, pretty familiar with like the politics out there. And I was amazed at the level of confidence that some folks had that race was going to be close. And if you look at what the final margin is, like it just wasn't at all. We're going to get into what might be the reason for that. But, you know, yes, this map ended up, I think, the way that people thought it could end up, you know, in 2021, maybe even decent portions of 2022. But I don't think that this map really ended up the way that a lot of folks on the other side of the aisle thought it would in October of 2022. And so that's a little bit of a shift in the races that are still out there, maybe starting from kind of least controversial to most. In the state of Alaska, that's going to be, you know, that we know, whether Senator Murkowski comes back or not. We don't know. Alaska's a tough place to poll. I have to think she will. You know, she typically always pulls these things out. So there's that one, but it will definitely be an R. State of Arizona, you've had some pretty prominent commentators who have already called that one. If you look at the votes that are out, if you look at where they are, it would seem that Senator Kelly is probably going to pull that off. Maybe we'll talk about the runoff in Georgia first, because I honestly think that what might happen to Catherine Cortez Masto is probably more controversial at this point. State of Georgia, yet you have this runoff coming up. Senator Warnock won more popular votes, but the Libertarian candidate's votes obviously could swing to Herschel Walker. I really think a lot of what's going to determine what's going to happen in that runoff is what's the mood within the country and within, in particular, the two parties in this intervening period. If there is some infighting within the Republican Party, I think that only benefits Dems. You know, I think Dems do feel pretty good today. That being said, when you look at the governor's race, I mean, it wasn't really close there. So if Walker picks up those Kemp voters who crossed over and who on this side actually crossed over, that's not good for me, at least. And so, you know, that I really think it remains to be seen kind of what the mood is. And I don't think we're going to know what that is probably for another, I would say a week, maybe two. State of Nevada. This is where it gets kind of fun, just because everybody on my side, and I would also say everybody on my side and John Ralston, I just want to throw that in, you know, seems to think that if you look at where the votes are and if you look at the way that they're breaking, that Catherine, that she pulls this off. I know there is a different theory on the Republican side. Before Dimitri says that, all I would say is that I think that the trend that you're looking at is Dem overperformance, right? And so when you're looking at these mail-in ballots and when you're looking at, you know, even drop boxes or like wherever else, maybe in the past you might have thought that they would break, let's say 55-45, but what you're seeing, like there was a mail drop this morning, I think. And I want to say it was 60-40, 65-35, something like that. And so if that trend holds, then she's probably okay. But I know there's a difference of opinion, and I know I'm going to go ahead and turn back over to my colleague briefly to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start in Nevada, but I think the same really applies to Arizona. You know, as expected, I think we've seen across the country a lot of the mail-in ballots lean, you know, fairly heavy on the Dem side. I think what has taken some folks by surprise is the drop box ballots, the same, you know, that you can drop off before or, you know, day of election. And I think that there's a lot of optimism that Republicans feel like they've performed much better in the drop box ballots than they expected to. folks feel more comfortable, I think, on our side, dropping them off physically rather than, putting them in the mail. So when you look at Arizona, there's 290,000 Dropbox votes still to count, a number of them in Nevada. So if that's what we're looking at, I think that there's a hope, particularly in Nevada with a lead already, that the outstanding votes maybe don't skew as much because you've got a mix of the mail-in and the Dropbox.
So there you go. Clear as mud.
Todd, before you move on, I'm happy to jump back too. I think, when you look at some of the other races, I think from our side, when you look at the Patty Murray race, I'm sure you've heard this a lot already today, and you'll continue hearing it. Candidates matter. I think there was a feeling that there was a really good challenger out there to Senator Murray. And I think a part of the other thing was, her last race was in a presidential year that drove turnout and, against then, candidate Trump. Her last non-presidential race, which was 2010, she won by less than 5 points. So I think the feeling was, given the mood in the country, the climate, the idea that, the president's numbers are underwater and the economic numbers are underwater. You had a good candidate on the Republican side. And you did see a close race in a non-presidential year, that I think that was, all combined, I think gave some extra hope. And then on Georgia real quick, I think one of the questions that Todd left out is it going to be for the Senate? Once we see what happens in Nevada and Arizona, if one party wins both of those, then, it changes the dynamic in Georgia a lot, right? Do Democrats come out and vote big if they've already got control of the Senate, vice versa with Republicans? It does seem to me like there is the party is doing everything they can to avoid the infighting of the past or in other places. There is a concerted effort to get the Libertarian, who won, I think, over 2% of the vote, to endorse or at a minimum stay neutral. So I think there's going to be a pretty, united effort. I agree with Todd wholeheartedly. It's going to take a couple of weeks till we see kind of the sentiment. And I think part of that's going to be, is it for all the marbles or is it kind of an extra seat?
Someone asked a question and I'll expand on the question a little bit. So there's been lots of stories of, did Dr. Oz make the mistake of getting on the stage with Trump a week or so beforehand? And that kind of bleeds into Georgia of Trump says he's going to announce his presidential campaign next week. What does that do? Does that bring people up and get them more excited who align with that camp? Does it dampen things after the results of the past few weeks? Does it not drive? Do you have any guesses? I think is the best any of us can probably make.
Well, look, for me personally, I was giddy whenever I saw that Oz was going to hold that rally on Saturday before the election, because to me, his path to victory was crossover voters from Shapiro. And quite frankly, I felt like he could probably do pretty good with them, because I imagined you had probably some country club Republicans, some old line Republicans. I imagined you also had some wealthy Democrats, other folks who really are not maybe are focused on social issues to a degree, but are certainly gettable to someone who they think is reasonable, and to someone who they think is going to vote for their interest. And I don't know what John Fetterman's real appeal was to them. So to me, I thought that Oz had a great chance to get Shapiro crossover voters. You do not have that when you get on stage with Donald Trump on the Saturday before your election. That is amazing to me. I'll just say it. I've heard from people who were close to that campaign. The comment was made that they didn't know if he had a choice. So I don't know if Trump maybe necessarily said, "I'm coming to Pennsylvania." And they said, "Great." When? It's Saturday. And then it kind of goes from there, and you can't really say no, because if you say no, then Trump tweets that out, and then truths that out. And then that spins out its own way. So yeah, I mean, for me, I thought that was a horrendous mistake. So as it goes to Georgia, if I'm in the Herschel Walker camp, I'm trying to figure the delicate way to move a little closer to Kemp and a little further from Trump. And if you can figure that out, then you can probably win. It's going to be hard, but that would definitely be what I would be thinking. So, but that's on my side.
Yeah, I'd probably be wise to leave it there, but I'll jump in a little. I mean, the bottom line is, President Trump drives people to the polls, and you need your base to turn out. The double-edged sword of that is he drives them both on, the Democratic side and the Republican side. So, I mean, you can't have a low base turnout and hope to just get crossover votes. So it is a delicate kind of balance, I think, in that space. I mean, I think in Georgia, the other factor we didn't talk about is, when an incumbent doesn't win up front, sometimes it becomes a little bit harder on the back end. I think people know Herschel Walker is endorsed by President Trump, is close to President Trump. I don't think there's going to be any big surprise there. So whether President Trump is running again or not, or holds a rally for him or not, you certainly have, again, I think in my mind, the Republican Party as a whole really coalescing around him. It's just announced that they've got basically bought into Governor Kemp's ground game and his whole team there. So he's going to have that turnout machine already. He's going to have the support of the governor there. I'm sure he's going to have support of many other big name Republicans who have been traveling the country. So again, I mean, it depends. I think we're in a different place now. You've got full Democratic control. You've got a Democratic president to backstop. So do people want a check, and is the seat for control of the Senate or not?
I'm going to throw kind of one more thing out there, and maybe we can talk about the committees if folks want to, but if we want to kind of talk more about these things, that's fine with me. But, one of the things that I was going to talk about in kind of a larger wrap up on like what we've learned is it's difficult for me as a Democrat to take this election as a "we believe in Democrats" like message. It's just hard. I mean, I don't think that really, when you look at the metrics, that they support that in any way, shape, or form. But to me, very definitively, they support I don't really know what percentage of the American population is behind Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is, if you run a different candidate in Pennsylvania, I actually don't think we win that race. If you run Sununu in New Hampshire, I don't think we win that race. If you run a different candidate in Arizona, it's definitely closer. I'm not sure that we win that race. And Georgia, I mean, you see it with Kemp. So without those Trump-picked candidates, and there were people in those primaries, particularly Pennsylvania, who 100% could have won. Without that, we're having a different conversation. And so it's hard for me to downplay that factor whenever, again, I don't think we would have won in those places. In fact, I'm almost sure of it if it hadn't been for Trump-picked candidates.
We talked a bit on the House panel just earlier about how this was kind of a more like hand-to-hand combat election, that like choice was a swing from one side to the other in some states. In others, it was candidate quality. In others, it was such and such different things. And I think a kind of similar trend exists here of like, who else was on the ballot with you? And did they pull people up? Like, what was the quality of the candidate? It all kind of varies a little bit there.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, and I know we all try to do it, and I know we'll discuss some of it today, but the idea of these kind of sweeping generalizations of this election went this way because of this issue or because of this factor. And I think, it goes into a kind of a multitude of factors, from the candidate to the state that they're running or the district that they're running in. Who else is on a ticket with them? I mean, there's just so many factors where mean, there are places in this, in the country that a strongly Trump-backed candidate would do fantastic and did well. There are obviously other places where that's not always the case. So, it just really varies, and you have to kind of look at so many kind of, I think, smaller issues within, a race to unpack what happened.
Wonderful. I think that's all of the questions that we have submitted about like race outcomes, but we got more on the leadership side and the policy side. So I think we can dive in there. So I'll move here on the committee leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just very quickly touch on the biggest changes here on either side. Obviously, you've got Senator Collins taking appropriations on the Republican side, with Senator Shelby's retirement, Roger Wicker taking over armed services with Senator Inhofe's retirement. Senator Cruz then falling in line at Commerce with Senator Wicker leaving. I think if you go to the next page of this, you can see, Senator Paul at Health, Senator Johnson at Homeland Security. So there's quite a bit of shuffling going on, despite, or, outside of the election, just with all the retirements basically happening from senior Republican members.
Yeah, and I mean, it's obviously less so on the Dem side just because of our rules. Senator Murray taking over Probe's obviously a big deal, but I don't know if that's like a fundamental shift in the way that committee operates. She's been around for a long time. She knows what's going on. The big one is Senator Sanders taking over Help. That is a big platform on a lot of issues that he cares about. Watching Senator Sanders and Senator Paul preside over a hearing, I think is going to be exciting for everybody. So
Someone just wrote in the chat, good grief, about
that's the
Holland,
major one.
Bernie Sanders working
Yeah, and I mean,
together.
look, this is actually probably as good a time as any just to say this. I think that when things like this happen, there's always speculation, right? There's always speculation that will Dems let Bernie Sanders take over Help. And I was actually involved with two of these things. My first boss, Senator Blanche Lincoln, whenever she was taking over Ag, people associated with Sherrod Brown do not like to be reminded of this, but he actually made a comment in the press that he was not sure that Senator Lincoln was the right person to be in charge of the Ag Committee because of her bent towards Southern agriculture as opposed to the Midwest. And so there was all this speculation about whether Blanche would actually take over the Ag Committee. She did. When Senator Wyden was taking over the Finance Committee, I was working for him, and there was all these stories behind the scenes about how they weren't going to do it, and people weren't going to let him, and maybe Chuck Schumer was going to swoop in, maybe he was going to do something there. It didn't happen. So if you start to hear any speculation like that about oh, I don't know if they're going to let him take over a committee, I never buy it, because that is such a big deal. I mean, it is you taking that step is nuclear. And so I would not buy any of it ever, no matter what you see. The people who are going to ascend to these committee chairs. They just don't get challenged.
Yeah, we've got folks in the chat now who are saying that they're going to come together for a wine night to watch some of those crack open a bottle with the chaos that might ensue. Someone did ask, what is the likelihood Paul gets Help chair? Do you think there's any potential option B or any of these that you see as not set in stone?
I mean, I agree with Todd. I think it's the same on both sides. It's very difficult to jump somebody. I mean, when you're the home state of junior senator of the majority leader or minority leader, whatever McConnell ends up as, going around something like that is difficult, controversial, and I just don't see it happening.
And then there are some questions on the leadership side of any possibilities of a Mitch McConnell not being the Republican leader in the new year.
No, is that good enough? I mean, I think there's rumbling. I mean, the folks who are rumbling, it's political posturing for the most part. I mean, he has got, I think, the confidence of just about everybody, the support of just about everybody. I think he's obviously been very successful, in that role. Elections come and go, you lose some, you win some. But he's the Republican leader, I think, until he decides he's not in the Senate.
I mean, I would tell you, as a Dem who has watched Mitch McConnell just beat us all over the field for decades now, I would love nothing more than if someone would put a strong challenge up to him. That would be fantastic. Please.
Awesome. I think those are all our questions on leadership. So I think we can dive into some of the policy and things that we might see in the coming year. I guess I would love to put out a hypothetical as a starting point. Let's say that Dems sweep the 3 races and we get Warnock, Cortez Masto, and Kelly, and actually gain a seat. Is there any new policy that's on the table with 51 where Joe Manchin's ability to hold sway is fractionally less?
Well, I mean, I think that the major factor there is if the House, there's a narrow path by which Dems could take the House, right? I don't think that's going to happen. I'll say it up front, but it does exist. If that happens, then it's time for reconciliation again. And you've probably got multiple bills that you can do. Now, as we've all learned in the last 2 years, I sincerely hope everybody's learned the arcane rules that surround that process. You have to do things that have an actual revenue effect, but as we've all seen, that's a pretty open area. The interesting thing to me there, if it's 51, is now no longer can either Joe Manchin or Senator Sinema sink it. They have to do it together. Now, that being said, they may be fine with that. They are both up in 2024. And I saw someone actually had a question about, kind of how does this election, the presidential, play into 2024? I think that, me personally, I like both of those members. I have very good relationships with both of them and their staff. I haven't heard this from them, but I can't imagine that Joe Manchin kind of loved the way this election went. To me, that only makes it harder for him to get elected in 2024 in West Virginia, where he's the only person who could possibly pull it off, but it's just going to be really hard, right? And so, if you're able to let him take a pass, if he's able to vote no against everything because you've got 51, that's probably pretty great. He probably needs that much more than 50-50. But again, that really depends on the House, because if it's a Republican House, I don't know that 51 really matters, because I'm not sure what a 60 vote Senate can send that they could do.
I guess going off of that, so thinking of things that the Senate can do without, or like what the Senate's influence can be with that split vote, one thing being confirmations, any trends that we can expect to see in folks who might get confirmed with continued Democratic majority in the Senate?
Well, I think that, Senator Schumer has made very clear just in the last few days that there will be a renewed focus, much like what we saw in the lead up to this election, of confirming as many people as possible. The reality is that there have been a lot of delays. That's something that both sides does. I'm not saying it's one or the other. And, they still have a lot to process. And if you really don't think you can get something large through, your time's probably better spent doing that. And so if there's a Republican House, but you've got this Democratic Senate majority, I 100% could see Senator Schumer saying, it doesn't matter if we pull together, for example, someone's talking about the Farm Bill. It doesn't matter if you pull together a Farm Bill and it gets 65 votes. It's still going over to a House that, has a margin which is tiny. And it has a structure and a leader who may not be able to go court Dem votes to get this done. So I could spend 2 weeks doing that Farm Bill, right? Or I can spend 2 weeks confirming people. And so I think that a lot of floor time will be devoted to noms, because that actually has a tangible effect. You're not going to burn 2 weeks on a bill which is going nowhere. You're just not. I mean, the Farm Bill was a poor example, because I truly believe that the Senate will definitely pass one, 100%. I have full confidence in that. But other things, I mean, I could absolutely see, if that's your choice, burn 2 weeks on this or do noms, do noms.
Awesome. And then someone asked, what do you think are the driving factors behind John Fetterman's relationship with the Democratic Party? How do you predict it will impact the 118th Congress?
I think that he has a good relationship with the party. The DSCC and others were very involved in helping him raise money in the campaign, in all sorts of things. His campaign welcomed that. You know, I'll be careful what I say here. He has a very carefully crafted image, and it works very well for him. But at his core, this is the second statewide race that this guy has won, and that's in Pennsylvania. And that's a pretty diverse place. That's you have to be a pretty good politician to be able to figure out kind of how to unite all those coalitions. To be honest, as some of his opponents found out in his primary. So I think he's a pretty astute politician. The whole hoodie thing and all that, it's a great brand. But I think he's pretty savvy about kind of knowing how to actually play that game. So I would imagine he'll carve out a role. He'll be engaged, and hopefully he'll do well.
Someone actually asked a question about the hoodie, I think a little bit as a joke, but I think there's a real question in there of like, who's going to tell him he can't wear the hoodie on the floor? And I am curious of like, how does he bring this brand that he has built to like a formal Senate hearing or those things? And what does that look like?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I truly don't know, because there's going to be a lot more pictures of him now in a suit and tie, and that's just the reality. But you know, that being said, on the other side of the aisle, I've seen Dimitri's people wearing like seemingly 3 layers, like a fleece and a blazer and a button-down shirt and then like something else, and that's almost as offensive to me as a hoodie. But so I don't know, but he's definitely gonna have a lot more pictures taken of him in a suit and tie. He's definitely gonna be more formal, and how he kind of moves that, I don't know.
So Dimitri, question for you. Of new freshmen, we do have more Republicans who are brand new to the chamber with Eric Schmidt, Ted Budd, JD Vance, Mark Wayne Mullen. Anything notable about these folks while they will be junior members in a chamber of 100? Anything that you can expect to see from those folks that people on the policy side might be interested in?
Yeah, I think you have an interesting mix of, you know, folks coming from the state level, folks coming from the House. You know, again, we'll see kind of what happens with the last remaining seats out there. You know, to some of the to this question, to the previous question a little bit. I mean, the Senate in a lot of ways runs itself, and this idea that people are going to come in and change it and do all this, you know, stuff and let's light the world on fire is just not really that realistic. 99% of the time you have the Republicans, you know, coalescing behind Leader McConnell, you know, same on the Dem side. Obviously more difficult, I think, when you have 50-50 and you're going for reconciliation, but you know, I don't think we're going to be in that space. So it will be interesting to see. I mean, with a new member already saying he's not going to support McConnell, you know, what does that mean? You know, how does that help you get the committee assignments that you're looking for when he inevitably is the leader again? But, you know, I think it takes folks, even from the House, a little bit of time to kind of find the Senate and figure out the differences in the working environment and how the floor works and the leadership and all that kind of stuff.
Question on what does the 50 versus 51 potential number mean for committee splits and committee membership?
Well, with 50-50, you know, you still had some committees which operated. Well, no, wait, you didn't, did you, Dimitri? Like they were all even. At 51, obviously, you know, you gain a vote. You don't under any precedent that I remember gain a 2 margin. You would only gain a 1. But I defer to Dimitri on that to make sure that I'm right, because I think I am. But
I mean, it's a negotiation. I'm sure there'll be an argument for 2 vote margins in some committees, but yeah, I assume it'll be
right.
Whenever.
Yeah.
I mean, it just makes life easier, right? I mean, you know, all you have to do is hold your side and you win the vote. Versus now you're trying to pick up other people, you're discharging things. I mean, it's just it's a different process. Obviously it's different on the floor as well, right? I mean, the vice president won't have to be around nearly as much if Democrats have 51 or Republicans have 51.
So a question that kind of crosses Senate and House, but kind of in general, is there anything major that gets done in this session? Or are we, with such slim margins, split House and Senate, are we talking messaging bills and one-sided? Like, what are the things on the table that we could actually see get done?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, I think that in terms of what gets done, it's hard for me to say like what gets done, because I'll be honest, I'm very pessimistic. I mean, as I said earlier, I believe that Republicans will be in control of the House. I think it will be by a very slim margin. I think that Kevin McCarthy will be in a tough spot because I think that he'll need Democrats to come over to vote for things for them to pass. But when that happens, then his leadership will probably be under threat. So I think that it's just hard, to see a lot there. But in terms of things that, are going to come up and people are going to attempt, first, I think regardless of who is in control of the Senate, be it Republicans or Dems, I think they're going to try and show a sense of normalcy and a sense of, we process appropriations bills, we do a budget, the farm bill is expiring, therefore we're going to work on the farm bill and we're going to try and pull this together. I think that it doesn't really matter who's in charge, right? Because they're going to want to, it's going to be beneficial to their candidates, it's going to be beneficial to everybody to show that they're adults. The other things that are kind of out there, I like bringing this up all the time, but there was a Senate office that had an intern kind of dive in. This was a while ago, and the number may have changed, but I have a feeling it's roughly the same. Looking at when a bill was introduced and how long it took before it became law, and the average was apparently like 7 years. And so if you look at what has been happening with the tech sector, and if you look at the way that people have been looking into that from a standpoint of privacy or like whatever else, you're kind of around that mark. You're getting into that kind of 7-year type time period, and you have this odd coalition on the right and on the left who both are not really all that happy with tech. So, personally, I think that is an area where people could make an attempt to see if you could get a bipartisan bill together that you can move. I don't know if it'll be successful, but I feel confident that they'll try it. So that, the farm bill, and then the final thing is if someone can come up with something on China that's really, going at either, trade, manufacturing, like national security, like whatever. That's another one where you do have, folks on the right and on the left who are both united around that. And so I think anything in that space as well is ripe for something to at least kind of move. But I don't know if anything passes. I'm just going to go ahead and say that.
So I guess I have a slightly more optimistic view, and I'm glad our House colleagues already went, so they can't fight back after I say this. But I mean, Todd and I are both Senate guys, and it's very hard, in my opinion, that when you have things like the farm bill, things like infrastructure packages, get done in the Senate in a very bipartisan way for that to just be left on the cutting floor. I mean, at the end of the day, there's enough good stuff in a lot of these bills that people get pressure and they find a way to cross the finish line. I mean, I totally agree with Todd. As we've seen with Democrats, a small majority House of Representatives is not the easiest to deal with. But even in that dynamic now, we found ways to get things like, a bunch of big, I think, bipartisan compromises done. And the other thing with Leader McConnell is, I mean, he's not going to allow Todd's comment about normalcy and all that. I mean, he picks his spots very well of when to fight, when to obstruct, and when to work, and when to get stuff done. And so I think that there will be opportunities through things like, again, the Farm Bill, FAA. Obviously, we have NDAA every year that has to get done, probes.
And what are we looking at for the next however many weeks are left in 2022? Anything that we see get done while Dems still control both chambers, or what are we looking at there?
I mean, I do think some of that really does come down to if Dems, if Arizona has gone the wrong way, and if Nevada has gone the wrong way, and then there's a runoff in Georgia, and if there's still a chance that, Dems might lose control of the chamber, I mean, I think that works both ways. I think that if you're on the Republican side, you're like, well, wait, we might have control. Do we really want to sign off on like any big deal right now, considering that we might be in charge here pretty soon? And also from the Dem side, going back to nominations, it's like, well, we actually may not be able to do these next year, like on anything near the level that we have now. So I think it's tough to say at this point till you really know who might have control of the chamber. Either way, that's a constraining effect, right? And you do have limited time to kind of pull these things together. So defense authorization bill, but I don't know if there will be a lot of extraneous things on that. I mean, there will be some, of course, there always are. But I'm not totally sure how much, that you'll see that becoming just a big Christmas tree. There are some things within the tax base that people will certainly be taking a look at and will certainly be trying to do, but by passing the IRA, on the Dem side, most of those extenders, a lot of them were typically within the clean energy space. That's gone now. You actually don't need those. So, you're talking about things like R&D and other stuff, but people want them. So, you're going to look at that there too. And then finally funding the government. I still am of the belief that they will pass a full omnibus that will fund the government, that they won't punt to a CR on either some things or all things or whatever else to early next year or the middle of next year. I think it's in everyone's benefit to not do that, to set up fewer cliffs. So that would be kind of my read based on conversations with Senate leadership and kind of other folks like that.
I mean, I would assume until, after December 6th, the Senate's doing nothing but noms, right? I mean, you want to get through as many people as you can, and you want to see where things stand after that, and then slow down if you're still in the majority and kind of get through the other issues, or find ways to condense the other issues and keep doing noms if you're not in the majority still. I mean, we obviously have, I know there's questions in the chat. I don't see, approach slipping into next year. I think certainly nobody on the Senate side wants that. I think that's some of this stuff kicking to next year much more appealing. And, from a House perspective, when you're thinking you may have a 30-seat majority, but when you have to corral, and keep every single member in line or afford to lose one or two, I mean, it's, you lose, I think, some of the leverage and some of the desire to pick, some more of those fights. I don't know what Todd thinks about this actually, but obviously you do have the Electoral Count Act and marriage equality kind of floating out there too. I would think there's probably a lot of folks on the Republican side that wouldn't mind just putting some of those issues to bed and getting them behind us and not having to talk about them in 2024 or for the next couple of years. So with them clearing the House and the House possibly flipping, it might be the only chance.
Well, and I think that's actually perhaps that really puts perhaps that's a good transition to put kind of a fine point on it, because I see a lot of things in the chat about child nutrition, Bidoof, and whatever else. The biggest enemy of everywhere right now is time. I mean, it's just time. And, I think that the two things that Dimitri just brought up, those are things which I think that Schumer and others and Dems would say that's worth the time. The reality is that you are going to have to spend a week. I mean, you're not going to get, I don't think, UC to dispense with the various time agreements that you'll need to go through with in order to get those things passed. So if you're Schumer, you're saying, kind of to come back to a theme here, how many noms will I not be able to do this? Those two things, the Electoral Count Act and marriage, I think that if they can do them, they will, and they'll burn the time, and that will be that. But other things, anything controversial, anything that would take some time to work out, that's your biggest enemy, is the clock. There's just not enough weeks, there's not enough time, and they're going to prioritize things.
Well, and to the clock, I mean, the only thing I would say is Leader Schumer, I think, has two important tools at his disposal, and that's Thanksgiving and Christmas. So yes, a time agreement would be very hard, but bring something to the floor on December 21st and say we're not leaving until this is done. it manages to lift some holes pretty quickly and get people motivated to figure out a deal to move on. So
Great point.
see how that plays out too.
It's a great point.
I guess the last question I'd love to end on, and looking ahead, you talked a little bit earlier about how Manchin is up for re-election in 2024, and so how his behavior might shift to in a 51 seat majority to help set him up for that election. Who are some of the other folks who have races coming up in 2024 who we might, and how might those shape their behaviors over the next 2 years, either in ramping up their activity, ramping down? Who are some of those people to look out for?
I'm gonna let you go first, Dimitri.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, Democrats are going to be defending a whole lot more seats. I don't think that, there's really, I mean, you've got Rick Scott up, you've got the Indiana seat if Senator Braun, decides to run again, that are probably were the closest last, cycle. I think the expectation is Florida's probably not as close anymore. I don't know if Indiana is either. On the Dem side, I think Republicans have a pretty target-rich environment, right? It's Montana, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, Wisconsin. I mean, there's a lot of targets out there. So I think there's a number of members, and if it is a lead, Majority Leader McConnell, the strategy is pretty much divide and conquer, right? I mean, try to get these folks taking bad votes as often as you can, even in the minority. I mean, that's what you're trying to do on budget and a bunch of other places. So it will be interesting, with ours having to defend so many this time, and that flipping.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's not a great map for Dems. Like that's just the truth. There's just kind of no way around that. But in terms of who would kind of change maybe the way that they've operated in the past to now, a lot of those people have been elected multiple times. I mean, people know who they are. My old boss, Senator Stabenow, she's going to be Debbie Stabenow. I mean, that's just it. It would not benefit her to change that. Sherrod Brown is Sherrod Brown. Doesn't matter what just happened in this last election with Tim Ryan. I'm sure that they'll figure out some ways around the margins, but by and large, it's just kind of set who you are. Bob Casey, Pennsylvania. So I don't see people fundamentally changing, and I would throw Senator Sinema in that same category. She is very confident in the persona and the role that she's crafted for herself. And I think that she's more than ready to run on exactly what she's done up to this point. Manchin, I think, will probably carve out a role as even more of a foil. Definitely opposite the president. I mean, he has to. The numbers there are bad. They're real bad. So I could see him becoming even more of a foil. But yeah, we're defending a lot of seats, but the people who are defending those seats are people who've been around for quite some time. And so I don't really know if they're able to kind of pivot like that.
I said that was my last question, but I had one more that I asked Carl in the last session of, we're pretty sure Republicans will take the House, but there's always the chance, there's still that slim chance the Democrats take it. The Senate side, I'd say greater than 50% chance it's Democrats who take it, but there's still a path for Republicans. So Dimitri, what's the issue that comes back on the table if Republicans get those two chambers? What's the thing that we're not talking about right now that folks need to be aware of if that unexpected but totally possible option comes to fruition?
So I think it's a great question. It's also a very difficult question to ask for a number of reasons. One, I mean, with the slim House majority, I mean, it's what can the House get done? Leader McConnell, I think, goes out of his way not to kind of put out big roadmaps or plans for the Republican future. So that's, held, I think, pretty closely about what he would like to see happen. Todd and I had a conversation about this yesterday that, the Senate, depending on different positions, right? If you've got Leader McCarthy and they're able to pass, changes to immigration law and changes to, tax policy and things like that on a more partisan basis. somebody's your foil on the Senate side. And the question is it a Republican or is it a Democrat? Because you need 60 votes to get that done over on the Senate side. So, it's a great question. And frankly, I just think it's too early probably to tell exactly where it goes.
Sure. Well, we will be looking out for those results in the next couple of days for the states that will be hopefully called in the next couple of days, and then a couple of weeks for Georgia. So like 2020, we were in the same boat when we held this event in 2020, waiting to see what happens in Georgia. And here we are 2 years later. So thank you so much for your time, Todd and Dimitri. We have gone through so much content, but we are not done. In about 10 minutes, we're going to kick off chatting about the executive branch while not up for re-election. These results obviously have a huge impact on what the White House and executive agencies can accomplish. So folks can stick around and we will kick that off in about 10 minutes. So please do not leave us. In the meantime, I am going to chat a little bit more about some of the strategies that we see folks deploying in the first quarter or so of the year with a new Congress, and how Quorum can help support those. So the big thing that we see happening now is some early grassroots advocacy strategies. There was a comment in Political Influence the other day of how grassroots is going to ramp up even more in the next Congress with the Republican stance on how their relationship with corporations has changed over the past several years, and that they really more than ever want to hear from the districts rather than the folks in Washington. And so while neither of those channels of communication with Congress will go away, we're going to see folks putting even more emphasis on the grassroots side. So at the beginner level, the thing that folks are focused on right now is growing their advocate lists and making sure that they have people who will take action when they need to throughout this Congress. At an intermediate level, they're focused a lot on advocate education right now and making sure that those advocates know who their new members are, if they have new members, what potential new majorities mean for their issues, and what issues might be reprioritized this year. And then at an advanced level, we're talking about what are those first campaigns that you're going to launch in the first days of the Congress when the most is being put on the table in terms of new bills. So that first early grassroots advocacy we see is running Share Your Story campaigns, teaching new members of Congress who their representatives in your district are. So before there's a vote, before there's a sponsorship that you want them to take, just calling on your advocates to send the simple message of, this is who I am, this is why I work with this association, or this is how these issues impact me. Please keep me in mind as you're voting and working through this Congress. So here I've got a screenshot in Quorum of what this looks like, of just a simple Share Your Story campaign. Then the other thing, did I skip a slide here? That I just touched on briefly is teaching your advocates about new officials. So this here, again, is my representative Patrick Kearney in the Massachusetts State House. With redistricting, with the number of retirements, and then with incumbents who lost their races, there are lots and lots of folks out there with new representation. And so teaching them who those folks are, what role they have on the issues that your organization cares about is a really effective way to drive additional engagement from those advocates early in the year. So here is an example of how folks can set this up in their Quorum Action Center, pulling in bios, pulling in contact information to really teach advocates who represents them and what that person cares about. These are all customizable. So if you want to edit to the text here to how your organization works with that official, all of that can be adjusted here. At an intermediate level, we also see folks doing a lot of advocate education on the issues and really driving engagement with those resources with things like gamification. So folks who use gamification, what that means is assigning point values for your advocates to take certain actions. And so while some of those actions might be to call your member of Congress or write them a letter, you can also add points to things like watching a video or reading an article. So all of those things can also drive points. And so when you attach prizes and incentives, it can get more folks who actually take the time to use those educational resources. We even see some clients who create quizzes to see if folks actually read through the article and they assign points to that. And so to make sure that it's really being absorbed. There's going to be a lot of new policy issues on the table this year, or adjusted in the way that they're talked about because of the close majorities in either chamber, regardless of which party ends up in power. And so the way that you talked about your issues in the last 2 years is going to be different, and your advocates need to be prepared to speak with authority on those issues, or be prepared to take action on issues they might not have been as engaged in the past year. And then, like I said, elevating new issues. Your priorities may have changed, and that may have an impact on which folks within your advocate network want to participate in campaigns. So an advocate who maybe was not especially active in the last 2 years, they may be a prime candidate to get more involved, because the issue that's the most important to them is now much more likely to see change. So these are just hypothetical examples I've got on this slide up here. But really taking the time to educate folks on where your priorities are going to be, so that you can find those people who might be more engaged. And then finally, one of the things we see folks doing is surveying their advocates. So we know that personal relationships are critical, whether it's a personal relationship with your lobbyist or with your advocates. And so now is a great time to really find out who actually has personal relationships that already exist. So here, Senator-elect Fetterman, find out, are any of your advocates his neighbor, or went to college with him, or their kids play on the same soccer team, and use those to build up your grassroots ambassador program. And then once you've done those surveys, if you've identified new grass tops ambassadors, or you found an advocate who's just really engaged and wants to do more, build out those expectations for what you expect of those top tier advocates. When should they schedule their first meeting? Early in the year. How often should they be meeting with them? Which staffers should they be responsible for building relationships for? Really building out that plan early in the year. And so again, right before we kick off, just want to highlight again that for anyone who's interested in learning more about Quorum, to please visit our website. And we've got about 2 minutes before we kick off with our executive branch panelists. So if anyone has any questions, they are welcome to throw them in the slides and chat here. For those who are just joining us, we will be sharing out the recording and resources as well after, if you missed our House or Senate panels. And we will be here until about 2:45 to talk with our executive branch panelists in just a